Hello everyone, welcome to Internally Screening. Today we're going to be doing a review of I Spit on Your Grave from 1978, directed by meir zarchi, starring Keaton. This film is very unique, iconic,
infamous
in ways you might be familiar with. If you know anything about this film, you probably know why. We'll be going into it, so a quick warning, this film is very much about very upsetting topics, and we will be talking about them in reviewing it. So if you don't want to hear about those topics, please click away. So this film is basically the film in a sort of very sub category of horror known as rape revenge, because the plot of this film basically revolves around a woman going out from New York into a rural part of the US, which was in the 70s apparently terrifying, because you have films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, so all kinds of terrible shit was going on. She goes out there, she's having a nice holiday, and she ends up getting sort of raped by a bunch of redneck guys. And the film is basically either a weird sexploitation film or a feminist critique of rape culture, and you can there's enough room to argue for both.
Yes.
With what this film provides. It's sort of similar to, like I said, a cross between Texas Chainsaw Massacre and like Deliverance or something.
Right, okay, yeah.
It's very much part of this sort of grungy, cheap 70s horror filmmaking that was making a lot of money back in the 70s.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't really quite mainstream enough to be palatable to everyone, but there was a market for these kind of grungy, dirty films. And
they would call them what? Video nasties?
Video nasties, right, yeah. It was all about trying to make something very shocking, which this film has succeeded at, and it has inspired, numerous sequels and remakes, etc., etc. Neither of us have seen this before. Adam, what did you think of I Spit on Your Grave?
Well, I mean, in spite of us having not seen it, this film does have a potent legacy. Even as a child, I remember hearing about this film, not about what it contained, but about it being like one of the few, or like a sort of part of a list of films that in the UK at least was completely banned.
Yeah, with like Clockwork Orange and stuff.
Yeah. So it was like, have you ever heard of this film? It's the most shocking film of all time. So, that legacy is kind of...
And it has a great title.
It does, yeah. And it's dissolved into urban myth at this point of just like, think of the worst film you could ever think of. Oh my God, it's this. So kind of coming into it from that perspective and knowing what to expect, I was still quite shocked about just how bare bones it was in terms of showing the horrifying sexual violence that it does. And it really does go to lengths to continue the violence, because you get a fair amount of development minorly, I guess kind of a fair amount of downtime at the very beginning, where you're establishing who she is, where she's going, what she's doing. And it is quite surface level. There's not really much in the way of depth, but it's kind of, I guess, the quiet before the storm. And it's just kind of letting you simmer in this place, knowing that there's something awful just around the corner. And when you do get to the violent sections, you kind of think it's all over at one point, and then it carries on, and it comes back again, and it comes back again. And it really lingers in this way. So what you were saying about it being able to view it from a feminist perspective and then sort of a sexploitation perspective, the sexploitation stuff where it feels really gratuitous, you could argue just in terms of its pure length and the amount of which it shows. The gratuity there, I can completely understand someone arguing this is way too much. Even for the point you're trying to make, or potentially trying to make, this is outrageous. And then when it comes down to the kills at the end, which is, what it's all building towards, there are some great ones, but there are also some kind of middling ones. There's a one I particularly enjoy in the bathtub.
That's the best one.
That's the best one. There's one where a man gets hung.
That's a good one.
But other than that, it's remarkable how little time you have at the end for its like big finale of like, okay, well, this woman's experienced this horrible thing, here's your revenge. I think the balance is completely off, and that kind of makes it uncomfortable. A bit even more so than
I don't think it necessarily comes down to the length personally. I think it basically comes down for me about, rape is always going to be like a very touchy subject to cover in a film, and how you portray it. It's, is there a wrong way? Is there a right way?
Right.
I'm not one to say. I don't know. I could see an argument for the length of the scenes, because they are very uncomfortable to watch. So you could argue that, okay, the point is that it's not letting you look away. You have to watch this. Because this happens or whatever. But my counter arguments that would be is that the scenes, the way they're shot, do seem to somewhat sort of revel in it and sexualize it, you know,
Okay.
in what the camera lingers on. It makes it sort of quite pornified in
Right.
a way that
Okay.
obviously I don't think works as a depiction of, you know, sexual violence. To try and titillate with that seems
Yeah, I can see that.
you could. It's the kind of thing you could maybe make work in like a French Extremity, Michelle Haneke type film where
the tone is just completely nihilistic and awful.
Yeah, or like, you know, it's like a very strong like satire or something. You know, you could maybe make that work, but as it is, I think the film was clearly, at the time at least, slightly trying to titillate people, which is a little bit sort of gross.
Yeah.
That's my perspective. And then I think you're right that the film is kind of middle-loaded and then does build to some fun stuff in terms of her getting revenge, which is just very satisfying to watch.
For sure.
But sort of just, the film sort of peters off.
Yeah. I mean, character-wise, in having them all be quite one-dimensional, it also there's only kind of one character I would say is given more than just a kind of light coating of character, which is the kind of the simple friend in this group. So there's a group of 4 guys, and there's one guy that he's like a virgin, he's got some kind of like learning or social difficulties, and there's this peer pressure of like really incessant peer pressure for him to do this awful thing. And I guess there's some potentially interesting commentary there, because, you know, he is the one that isn't just an obscene monster.
He's the only one who's like hesitating, isn't he?
Yeah, but then when he does do it, he does revel in it. So he's obviously an awful person, but it's interesting to see how he's been sort of formed into that through
he's supposed to,
that pressure.
He's kind of like to represent that, like, in my mind, I think it's quite a clever character thing of like, you know, he's complicit in it even if he's not inherently acting on it at first.
Yes.
And then it also is, he's sort of there to demonstrate that, you know, peer pressure has a huge element in like the sort of social psychology of something right?
Yeah, for sure. Because you could extrapolate that into a sort of wider societal thing about like, well, why do people do these awful things? Or, you know, the mistreatment of women maybe in less dramatic ways, but sort of in more systemic ways through society. It's how do people learn to treat people like this? And it's like a cultural osmosis from those around them. So this is a sort of hyper version of that, where the guy, in order to become peer pressured, is simple, is, you know, whatever you want to describe him as. But there is something interesting there, and something of note, you know, like I commend, you know what, it's one of the few sort of vaguely commendable things that the film does. It is a little frustrating how little I find there is with Camille Keaton's character, because while obviously the revenge stuff is very strong at the end, and I kind of liked, there's an element to which she turns her sexuality against them and kind of lures them in with the promise of more of what they took from her. She's like, well, she's kind of putting on a show of like, well, now you've changed my mind, and then she uses them in their vulnerable moment to fuck them over.
I kind of enjoyed that because it's kind of like she's playing into the like, the whole like, oh, you know, she was asking for the thing. She's very knowing of that. And then, you know, waiting to the perfect moment to sort of fuck them over the most, which is very satisfying.
And I think in those moments is probably where you could argue the film is its most feminist. Because it seems to actually be taking something of societal commentary on the way men will, particularly at the time, talk about women, but I mean, obviously it's still a problem to this day. But I do feel like there is just kind of a vagueness to her character that's frustrating. Like, she doesn't really seem to have much in the way of agency outside of her situation. Like,
she's not very built up as a character, and again, I could see a sort of arty argument for it in that, you know, she's supposed to represent, you know, be generic on purpose. So she is like a commentary piece as a stand-in for women, right? And this film is supposed to be sort of somewhat metaphorical. I mean, now that I say that out loud, there's probably an argument there as to how feminist is that to reduce a female character to that, to
a stereotype,
like even if it's intentional. I don't know. You could probably argue that way, that one way or the other. But I think that with a film that's not exploring that in a very sort of intentional feeling way, it's hard to really get much from it as a viewer, because all you really have when you're watching it is quite a sort of empty character. being ruthlessly like abused on screen, and then getting revenge.
It's very bare bones in that respect.
And I think the biggest thing is as well is just that generally speaking, the filmmaking here is not brilliant.
It's very amateurish.
I think there's some good editing, and I do quite like the lack of music. The film is sort of quite eerie in that way, particularly in some of the really violent scenes, with the way that it's just sort of, there's no like dramatic like violins or whatever. It's quite creepy in that way.
In a strange way, it kind of heightens her isolation, because I think that's something the film is very good at doing, is making her feel completely isolated from everyone else. Which again, if you wanted to be sort of charitable to the film and assume that it was trying to make a point with that, you could see another feminist argument in that of women feeling completely like alone in their struggles, you know, at one point or another it being very taboo for women to speak out about their sort of systemic oppression in these various ways.
I did also like the sort of narrative break where it cuts from her perspective to the guy's perspective, and then some of their inner squabbles where the slow guy is talking about they realise he hasn't actually killed her like he was supposed to, on orders of the sort of the leader of the gang, and there's a sort of mystery as to like what is she up to. I kind of enjoyed that suspense, but the film doesn't really keep it up for long, and eventually it feels, I think the biggest criticism I have of the last part of the film, despite it being most satisfying, is it feels a little like perfunctory and procedural the way she does it. Even though you do have some good scenes in there, like when she sort of seduces the guy and takes him to the bathtub and whatnot, and the same with the sort of slow guy, the way she sort of concocts and you see her plan unravel before you. That's quite satisfying, but the way it's structured does feel quite procedural, and there's not like another dramatic element thrown in there to liven things up. So I what would you rate this film?
I would give this film a 4 out of 10. I think as bare bones as the story is, I do think there is a level of dramatic tension and horror, like very visceral, real world horror in what you're being shown. And in spite of it being, like you say, a bit sort of titillating and kind of playing up the sexualized angle of it, just kind of thinking about that, you got to wonder, like, at the time, surely a lot of the audience for this film would have been male. Like, horror, perhaps in a very broad, generalized way, has often had a more male audience than a female audience. And I'm sure that's changed for various films and over time.
I think exploitation films in the 70s were probably like 90% male.
Right. So
specifically those sort of kind of films.
Yeah. So then maybe that kind of show of the sexual aspect of it is a little cynical, because you wonder if the real point of it was to be shocking, or was it actually to make a point? Regardless, you can see those aspects to it, and there is like sort of the power in the woman in a woman regaining her agency and not letting these traumatic events ruin her completely. She gains sort of a strength in coming back and gaining power over those that took power from her. Filmmaking wise, it's pretty average for the age, but not unexceptional, not so amateurish as to detract from the overall storytelling. So, you know, there are interesting elements to this which I can commend, but as an overall watch, it is difficult to stomach and probably not something I'd come back to.
Yeah, for me, I'm sort of between a 4 and a 5, because I think there is a sort of 70s shoddiness to the filmmaking. Like, it's not bad, but it's not great at the same time. Like, there's a sort of, it's not particularly well made, but I do think that this film, I can't really analyse it from a feminist perspective, but the film is making some points, even if it's like very outdated, and as I've said, I think sexualises the rape scenes in a way that is quite distasteful. There is a sort of a valid point being made within the film that is of value, and I think as a sort of artifact of the time, it's quite interesting, so I could recommend it on that level.
Right.
But yeah, in terms of me ever rewatching it, probably not. It almost feels like a bit of a wasted opportunity, because I do think it has something at its core which is quite interesting, which it doesn't fully capitalise on, or make, maybe entertaining is the wrong word, but make it as gripping as it could be. Because the beauty of horror, right, and horror films is that you can confront these really like terrifying, horrible things, and you can show them in a way that's interesting or scary or funny or whatever. And I don't think this film quite finds what it's going for and executes it in a way that is any of those things. So this has been our review of I Spit on a Grave. We hope you've enjoyed it. Probably enjoyed it, hopefully more than we enjoyed watching the film. I hope. If you like this review, please press like. If you dislike the review, please press dislike. We do have more horror reviews coming out as the month goes on. So subscribe to the channel so you see all those horror reviews that we're going to be putting out as much as we can before Halloween, and probably a few after. We'll see what happens. But in any case, we'll see you next time. Peace.
Peace.